Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, in our ongoing study in Paul and Jesus by James Tabor, published in 2012. We've looked at what Paul did not stand for with the Ebionites and Judaic Christianity. Now we're going to switch to the affirmative, and we're going to take a look at the positive side of what Paul did stand for, and how his view of resurrection came about. Really, at pages 78 to 98, the birth of the faith in the resurrection. We begin with block 1. Professor Tabor tells us it begins in Galilee. The apostles first claimed to have seen Jesus in Galilee. The women who discovered the empty tomb did not initiate faith in the resurrection. In John's Gospel, there's no young man or angelic interpreter at the tomb. Paul asserted that Jesus had become an embodied, living, life-giving spirit. So there is an absence of sightings in Jerusalem from a historical perspective. There were no sightings of Jesus in Jerusalem, says Tabor, except the experience of Mary Magdalene. But Mary Magdalene is not included in Paul's list of witnesses. There's a late document, the Gospel of Peter, discovered in the 8th century, testified as existing in the 4th century. It includes the empty tomb narrative. It does include the empty tomb narrative. It reads that after the empty tomb discovery, the disciples mourned and wept for a week. With no experiences in Jerusalem of sightings of Jesus, then they returned to Galilee and to their fishing business. It was sometime later that they began to have faith in Jesus raised from the dead. So, Professor Tabor tells us that faith in the resurrection came after the disciples had given up all hope. Then we have this birth of faith and resurrection. The sightings of Jesus in Galilee took place after the apostles had returned to fishing and had given up all hope. The Galilee narrative is actually added to John's Gospel as an appendix, chapter 21, after the Gospel had already ended in chapter 20. And Matthew follows Mark in emphasizing that it was in Galilee where Jesus first was seen. Matthew 28, 16 and 17 speaks of this sighting at the mountain in Galilee. It's a mountain where it occurs, and it's a visionary experience in the earliest Gospels, and according to our earliest testimony of the resurrection. But after all this data, we need to look at a chronology. So we've been told that our primary source is Paul. We've been told the early Gospels reported Galilee sightings. Let's look at block 2 and take a look at the chronology. If you look at block 2, we begin with Paul. Paul received his revelation 7 years after the crucifixion, and his experience was considered equal to all others. In Mark, there's no account of anyone seeing Jesus except the young man who meets the women at the tomb. And then there's the message to go to Galilee. In Matthew, at the tomb, the angel tells the women to tell the disciples to go to Galilee. And Matthew mentions the mountain in Galilee where some still doubted. In Luke, on the road outside Jerusalem, 2 men meet Jesus. They share a meal with him. Then Peter sees Jesus, and then Jesus appears to the disciples. In John, Jesus first appears to Mary Magdalene Sunday morning, then appears to the disciples, showing his wounds. 8 days later, he appears again to the disciples with Thomas present. And there's the appendix of the Galilee narrative that's added. The Gospel of Peter. The disciples leave after a week and return to Galilee. The disciples have no faith that Jesus is resurrected. Professor Tabor tells us there are 2 dramatic conclusions to be drawn from this chronology. And number one, the early texts of Mark and Matthew state that Jesus is encountered in Galilee, and the encounter is visionary in nature. Second, the later texts of Luke and John put the appearances in Jerusalem, and they are immediate, and they involve a flesh and blood being, showing the wounds, eating meals, not a spirit. So Professor Tabor says, look at the significant differences. Is it Galilee or is it Jerusalem? Is it immediate or is it later? Is it visionary or is it physical? How do we perceive the resurrection? And if you look at note 8, Professor Tabor tells us that these accounts in the Gospels are theologically motivated traditions. No harmony of the Gospels is possible concerning the resurrection. Paul must be accepted as decisive witness, period. And Jesus had a spiritual body according to Paul. So we must accept Paul as primary witness, says Professor Tabor. So now let's take a look at the affirmative. Let's take a look at block 3, Paul's concept of resurrection as mysterion. As mysterion. If you look at note 1, the Matthew account is a visionary account on a mountain where some still doubted. This was problematic for Luke and John. Therefore, Luke embellished the Mark account to include Jesus taken away in a cloud on the Mount of Olives. John includes a similar embellishment. Therefore, Paul alone must be our first-hand source. Paul must be our first-hand witness. Paul is last but not least. Paul declares he was chosen before birth to be an apostle. He also believed that his apostolic calling was prophesied in the Hebrew Bible. Paul felt that to the 12 apostles, God had not disclosed the full mysterion of his plan of salvation, that he had not disclosed his full mysterion plan. Paul's gospel included the disclosure of the mysterion mystery of the full disclosure of the plan of salvation. That takes us to a critical area, Arabia. Why did Paul go into Arabia after the Damascus Road experience? We look at Galatians 4:25. After Damascus, Paul went to Arabia. It is south of Israel where Mount Sinai is located. It is not mentioned in the book of Acts. Luke in the book of Acts has Paul linking up immediately with the first apostles in Jerusalem, but Paul swears this is not the case. Moses confronted God on Mount Sinai. Elijah confronted God on Mount Sinai. Professor Tabor believes that Paul went to Mount Sinai to commune with Jesus Christ, and that is where he received direct revelation, mentioned in Galatians. It's after 3 years that Paul goes to Jerusalem, after Arabia. And Professor Tabor tells us, and I agree with this, Paul spent his time in Arabia praying and meditating with the glorified heavenly Christ. And in 2 Corinthians, Paul mentions an ecstatic experience of being taken up into the heavenly realms. He was caught up into third heaven, didn't know if it was in body or out of body, and this experience coincided with Paul's time spent in Arabia for 3 years. So it's important for us to understand that the revelation in Christ for Paul was something over a period of time, including multiple visions, multiple revelations. So, in conclusion, note 5, Paul's revelation in Christ. Paul had been allowed to hear the mysterion, deep mystery of God's plan. The thorn in the flesh was given to Paul to keep him humble after receiving such a mysterion mystery. And Paul equates the thorn in the flesh with demonic attack or temptation. Paul compares his received message with that of Moses and Elijah, and therefore Paul becomes the expected return of Moses and Elijah in the last days. And we know from the Mark testimony, the Transfiguration tells us that the last days have arrived. So I have always believed this, and it's great to see a great scholar like Professor Tabor posit the same belief. And I've always believed that Paul, after being a persecutor of the church, And after the conversion experience on Damascus Road, I've always felt that he entered a period of prayer and fasting and meditation. I've always believed that's what Arabia was all about. And now I get confirmation from a true scholar in Professor Tabor who posits this position. I think it makes perfect sense. Paul had to be burdened with guilt. He had to be totally weighed down by this experience on Damascus Road, and he had to have a time of introspection, meditation, prayer, fasting before any ministry could even begin. And I believe, as we are told here by Professor Tabor, that Arabia and Mount Sinai became those places of meditation and receiving of the revelation, the direct revelation from Christ. So I think we have, as a first positive description of what Paul stood for, I think it's a beautiful lesson. We've already looked at previous lessons on Paul's decisive step away from the Ebionites and from Judaic Christianity, and now we know why. It's because he had a dramatic experience and a series of revelatory experiences in Arabia. Arabia becomes central for Paul and understanding Paul, and it often is neglected. I absolutely believe 100% that what Professor Tabor tells us here, I agree with it completely. I do believe that we should follow the chronology in Block 2, and I do believe we should follow the centrality of Arabia in Block 3. I agree with that absolutely. So we've shifted now into the positive articulation of Paul's gospel and Paul's concept of resurrection, and we are going to, we're close to page 100. We're going to pick up next time on page 99.